chick flicks, romantic comedies, rom-coms. You love them, you hate them, but we are here to eviscerate them. Welcome to the RomCom Killjoys podcast. I'm your host, Janelle Walker. Now, let's get on with some feminist joy killing. Welcome to the show, everyone. It's our 10th episode, which is not monumental for a podcast like This American Life or, Pop Culture Happy Hour, but for this little DIY project, it is. So for that momentous occasion, we are having a very special episode on When Harry Met Sally. And for that very special episode, we are going to have a round table of experts instead of our usual one guest. First up, we have co-producer Eliza Bertrand.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to be back. As you guys know, I am a TV producer and a producer of this podcast, and I love rom-coms, and I love making fun of them, and this is one of my favorites.
Excellent. We also have Kate Kearns.
Hello. I ghostwrite romance novels. I used to do other things. Now I ghostwrite romance novels.
Yes! And last but absolutely not in any universe least, Alice Lee.
Hi, I have no thoughts on either romance or comedy, and I just saw this movie for the first time yesterday.
It's going to be a perfect conversation. I'm pretty excited about it. Okay, so as we normally do, what we're going to do is we're going to read a summary of this film and then get into the very meaty questions that it tries to address. And by very meaty questions, I actually mean very meaty question that it addresses. So here's the description from Google. When Harry Met Sally, the year of our Lord 1989. In 1977... college graduates Harry Burns, played by Billy Crystal, and Sally Albright, played by Meg Ryan, share a contentious car ride from Chicago to New York, during which they argue about whether men and women can ever truly be strictly platonic friends. 10 years later, Harry and Sally meet again at a bookstore, and in the company of their respective best friends, Jess, played by Bruno Kirby, and Marie, played by Carrie Fisher, attempts to stay friends without sex becoming an issue between them. All right. Now, I am going to pose the question, as I do every week, that although this is what Google says this film is about, what is When Harry Met Sally really about? Let's start with Alice.
I really don't know if I'm qualified to say what this movie is about. In the words of Meg Ryan, it's not that deep. It's a movie about how men and women can't be friends. I would say that's the central thesis of the movie, and it pretty much proves that point, yeah.
Kate, what do you think?
So I think it's a movie about what happens when you start out a script thinking it's about one thing, and then you discover that actually the story you're writing is about something else, and then the, premise that you started off with ends up leaving, mild problematic aftertastes, but no one cares because the thing that you made is so great.
First of all, a little movie history background here. Nora Ephron, who's the writer, and Rob Reiner, who's the director, who had worked together before and were friends, had a discussion in which Rob Reiner pitched the idea of a movie about two friends who decide that they're not going to have sex because if they have sex, it will ruin the relationship. And then they have sex, and it ruins the relationship. And this is the pitch that he gave to Nora Ephron, who thought that was a hilarious concept and started writing it. And then over the next couple years, while they were working on other projects, the two of them kept sort of adjusting the story until they got the script they ended up with, in which it then became much more about the sort of how they become a couple rather than the how the sex ruins the relationship. But that is where it started. So Kate's totally correct that it started at one sort of angle and then ended up somewhere else. Both Nora Ephron and Rob Reiner have also said that over the years, people have come up to them time and time again and been like, I was best friends with this guy for 2 decades, and we, both married other people, and we blah, 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 and then we fell in love, and I watched When Harry Met Sally, and it's my story, and it's so amazing that you guys were able to write it. And they've had just as many people come up to them and say, that is not how it works. I had a friend. We tried to get together. It was a miserable disaster. That's not how it works at all.
I just have to say, I cannot imagine going up to a romantic comedy writer and being like, wow, did you ever get romance wrong? You failed, man. You totally misunderstand how people get together and fall in love, and shame on you. I just cannot fathom doing that. Oh, Nora Ephron, you have no idea how relationships work, and I can prove it through my personal experience. I mean, who does that?
It's a bold move. It's a bold move.
So I think that as we've laid out here, what we have before us is a great debate from which Nora Ephron is the primary philosopher that we can or cannot agree with on this topic. So let's lay out a debate, my friends. I want to lay out the case. Let's start out with the first case for the film, right? So let's lay out the evidence that the film offers us for men and women cannot be friends. Resolved? Men and women cannot be friends. What's the evidence?
Well, the main evidence here is clearly that by the end of this, they have stopped being friends. They have slept together. That has ruined the friendship, and then they realize they are in love, and at the end, they are a married couple. You also see them interact with each other's friends, but never really develop individual friendships across the gender divide.
Yes. That's fair.
Well, I think what interests me about this is the plot machinations get us there. But I think my big questions about the ultimate conclusion that men and women can't be friends, at which level, I trust Nora Ephron. If this is the vision that she has for this couple, I don't doubt her. I'm just interested in the first movement of the film when we first meet Harry and Sally, when they're taking this road trip across the country from Chicago to New York, and they're first meeting each other. I don't know, I guess from a philosophy of love standpoint, I always sort of wonder if there is an initial interaction with someone where from the jump that you have what, I think is it Sex and the City or some other source of romantic knowledge passed down through literature that invented the term frisson. Is anyone familiar with this term frisson? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have frisson with someone or you don't, right, Kate?
Yes. Yes, I learned that term from a Meg Cabot romance. That's what it was. That's where I learned that term.
In which case it probably came from Sex and the City because she references those a lot.
Yeah.
In The Princess Diaries.
Something that helps me a little bit with the whole men and women can't be friends thesis is I don't think that to me, watching this movie, it doesn't feel like that's the thesis of the movie. It feels like this movie allows its characters to change because it has a longer time arc, which I think is interesting. And at the beginning, they both have theories for everything, right? Sally is convinced that no woman would stay with Humphrey Bogart if all he owns is a bar. There's this setup of they have these grand overarching philosophies as they're heading to New York in their future lives. And then over the course of it, at various points, they'll even talk to each other and be like, no, I never said that, So to me, the men and women can't be friends part feels like one of those grand theories that people who recently graduated college say very confidently. And then by the end, it's not about sex getting in the way. It's about the fact that he loves her getting in the way, which is a very different thing than his big overarching theory that he started with and has narrowed to this very specific point that has nothing to do with whether or not he's attracted to anyone else in the room, doesn't have anything to do with other friendships with women he has or has had in the past. It's just about her, specifically her, and being head over heels in love with her. And vice versa, even though she says she hates him, but clearly, she loves him. So that's the way I resolved that. This big idea that for me, would greatly sour the movie if I genuinely believed it was what the movie was pitching me.
It is the through line that runs all the way through the film, though. It comes up at pretty much every intersection when they meet. Their first car ride, and then 5 years later in that airplane, and then 10 years later when they've both broken up, and then keeps going on, and sometime during their main friendship, you know, Harry says to his friend, whose name I just don't remember, that I've never been friends with a woman like this. And he sort of implicitly admits that he was wrong in his previous theory. And then, of course, the arc of the movie sort of did prove him right.
I think that, I mean, as we've said, the fact that they age through the movie makes a big difference because, as we all sort of learned throughout time, you want different things out of relationships at different stages in your life. And I mean that both out of romantic relationships or sexual relationships, but also friendships. And there's an argument to be made that this movie is not about romantic relationships, but about friendships. You know, you get a lot of scenes of Sally with her girlfriends talking about relationships, talking about herself. You get scenes with, you know, Harry and Jess, his friend, where they're talking about girls and they're talking about jobs and his divorce and, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And you get, I feel like, just as much of that as you do of these friendship scenes between Harry and Sally. And so maybe it's about what they're looking for emotionally out of relationships changing as time goes on.
I think that's a really interesting point, Eliza, especially because, and I don't know if any of y'all noticed this also, but when I was watching the film, I watched it with my mom. And one of the color commentary moments we had was after Harry and Sally sleep with each other, right? Thereby breaking this sort of like emotional intimacy, theoretically, that they had as friends earlier in the film. My mom pointed out, and I thought this was really astute, that they kind of automatically took on these really stereotypical gender roles where she got up to get him a glass of water, she was all sort of like submissive, and Harry was the man who left her. They took on these really specific power dynamics, which before in their friendship they didn't really have at all, you know? Sally was a lot more aggressive, she was a lot more assertive, she knew what she was about. Harry was a little bit more, I don't know, vulnerable. So I was really interested, too, in how somehow, at least in that moment, the film was sort of telling us that sex was getting in the way because it didn't meet their emotional needs. And ultimately, they kind of found that that was more important.
That's true what you've been saying, Janelle. It's that the movie is about two people modeling a new way to be in a relationship. Because Harry certainly does not have a healthy approach to relationships. And Sally has... we see this on-screen relationship where this man is just kind of letting her be in a long-term relationship with her, but refusing to commit, refusing to be serious. And then the moment she dumps him for not committing, he turns around, realizes bachelorhood is not all it's cracked up to be, and gets serious and committed to someone else. So they're as soon as they have sex, they just fall back on what they think relationships should be like instead of actually forging ahead with a relationship that would be meaningful and powerful to them both.
To me, it's interesting that for a movie that cares so much about whether or not two people have had sex or want to have sex, we don't actually see the sex scene. One of my favorite romance writers, her theory on when to include or when to do a closed door sex scene where you're like, oh yes, these people had sex, versus when to actually like show some level of them either leading up to sex or actually having sex or whatever, is if it changes the relationship, you show it. If it does not change anything in the story, you don't need to show it. And I think that it's interesting that for a movie that values this so much, you don't actually know, like, we know that this changed it, but we don't actually, like, was it awkward? Was it great? Did either of them learn something about the other? Like, did it confirm things they always knew about each other? Like, it does just, like, skim over that. What we really care about is how this affects their friendship. But I do think it is an interesting decision not to have that big turning point play out off screen.
And that's a really interesting point, because the way that we learn about how the sex was is that you then have that phone conversation with the friends immediately afterwards, right? You've got that great scene where the two of them call and Jess and Marie both pick up the phone, and they both admit on the phone that the sex was good. And they don't get into it, but that's how we learn that, like, that wasn't the problem. And so again, it comes back to this, the friendships are what's being affected and where the information is coming out and all of this, much more so than their actual, like, sexual chemistry being important.
And these are really interesting points, but to counterpoint, do we as an audience really want to see Billy Crystal having sex?
Yeah, it's impressive how attractive they managed to make him as a character in this movie, but, like, I'm at no point attracted to Billy Crystal.
No one is. That's the problem with the movie.
That's why after this, Meg Ryan is only ever in movies with Tom Hanks.
Lies. She's in a movie with Hugh Jackman.
Ooh, even better. Although that movie is terrible.
I mean, these are both upgrades.
Definitely upgrades. Although, what I will say is that I really like this movie. One of the reasons it works so well for Meg Ryan's career is that it really gave her a chance to be comedic. You know, she has so many funny scenes, and she's acting across from Billy Crystal, who's, you know, one of modern Hollywood's great comedians, and she holds her own so strongly that in multiple scenes she's the one who's taking over, which is amazing.
This leads me to an obvious topic, but that as a feminist cultural critic I can't overlook. Can we talk about the orgasm?
Yes.
Not in general, the specific fake orgasm that's happening in the deli in this film, of which it is so famously known.
Alice, I would love to hear your thoughts, since I know you hadn't actually seen the movie before.
So the scene opened in the diner, and I immediately knew what was happening. I hadn't known if it was this movie that the fake orgasm scene was in, or if it was in some other nebulous late 80s movie. But, like, the scene opened, and I was like, oh my god, it's the scene. Anyways, I thought that scene was great.
I remember reading a criticism of that scene that it was not in keeping with Sally's character, and so I was kind of thinking of that as I was watching and trying to decide, like, was this a case where they went through went for the amazing iconic joke as opposed to what fit for her character? But I'm completely on board with it, because she likes being right, and she is, and that side of her comes out the most with him. She is kind of most comfortable being at her most obnoxious when she's with him, and he doesn't think she's obnoxious, and he also realizes when she wins, which, you know, is a trait I look for in a man. So I loved this scene, even repeat watching.
An interesting thing about the way that this scene came about, this scene was not in several of the original versions of this script, but the script largely came out of discussions that were happening between Nora Ephron and Rob Reiner, as well as one of the other producers, about male-female relationships. And Rob Reiner had told Nora Ephron about, you know, what men talk about behind the scenes and all this stuff. And he said, okay, I've just told you stuff that women don't know about men. Tell me something men don't know about women. To which Nora Ephron responded, women fake it. And Rob Reiner didn't believe her. He has said multiple times in interviews that in this discussion, which was happening in his office, he was so convinced that no woman had faked it with him and that women didn't regularly fake it, that he walked out of his office into, like, the main, like, secretarial pool sitting outside of his office at the production company and asked all the women sitting there in a very inappropriate moment, have you all faked it with your partners? And every single woman was like, yeah, duh, and went back to doing their work. At which point, everyone involved in the discussion said, okay, we need to put this scene into the movie somehow. Because clearly this is a thing men and women don't talk about. And I personally think knowing that information makes the scene so great. But I don't know if maybe for some people having the behind the scenes information ruins it.
That's beautiful.
I have to admit that watching this, like Alice said, it's so iconic it almost doesn't feel real. Like it sort of happens in its own little vacuum. But I was thinking about it in that context of the time of 1989, and we've got a romantic comedy. I mean, the idea, one, that women like think about their own pleasure like autonomously is even in and of itself sort of a revolutionary idea then, I'd say. But then, you know, you also have this like just the display. Like, can we just talk about a little performance history here? Just the acting out of the faked orgasm in this scene is so momentous. It's just like a lightning bolt through the screen. That is such a rare thing to see addressed not with a male gaze. And I do think that this film, even though it is directed by a man, that scene is not male gazy at all. It is not sexualized. It is comedic. It is true. It is honest. I mean, everything about that to me was appealing and interesting and exciting.
Well, and one of my favorite moments of that scene is actually a quiet moment right when she's beginning to moan and to start to, you know, work herself up. There's a shot back at Harry, back at Billy Crystal, and he gets this look on his face that I feel like we've all made where he realizes what his friend is doing.
I love that.
And he doesn't quite roll his eyes, but he makes this face like, oh God, this is happening now. And it's just this relatable moment that, again, it's not sexual. He's not turned on by what she's doing, nor is he totally freaked out by it. It's mostly just this like, oh God, here we go. Resignation. And I feel like you get that in conversations about sex, whether they're conversations with your partner or with someone you're flirting with or with a friend. You get those moments where you're like, okay, are we going to go there? Yeah, we're going to go there.
Eliza, can I ask you another bit of film history?
Go for it.
The old couple is talking about how they met. That could have been the entire movie. What's the story there?
I feel like makes this movie so unique, and it really makes it shine because it does really make it feel like this is just one story out of a million and all of them are amazing. Those couples are actors, but the stories are real stories. They had older couples come in and tell the stories of how they met, and then they picked the ones that they liked the best and had them performed by actors. And so they feel authentic because they are.
I will say, though, because I gotta come in here and be my critical self. It would not be me if I didn't. There is something on a meta level about rom-coms and the influence that this movie has had on the rom-com genre, where these couples coming in and telling their very true stories and then having them performed by actors kind of sets up the rom-com as this, you know, cultural knowledge for how relationships are supposed to work. I'm curious about how the framing device has perpetuated this over the years, the idea that rom-coms are not just a fantasy, but they are sort of a reflection of how relationships are actually supposed to work, which is something we talk about on this podcast all the time. Like, oh, this isn't realistic, but why do we expect it to be?
So, first of all, I think that something that kind of frustrates me about the way we look at romance stories versus other genres of stories. I think that we get more angry if they are not... I feel like they're judged very differently than, like, a political thriller or, an action movie or anything. Like, there's this element of, because we all know relationships, we want it to neatly be either fantasy and we all acknowledge it's fantasy, or we want it to be a guide to life and we all acknowledge it's a guide to life. We're much less comfortable with the ambiguity that we grant other storytelling genres.
I think it's interesting that you bring up this point because one insult that men levy at women all the time is that life is not a romantic comedy. So women are belittled for believing in romantic comedies, but they're, criticized more implicitly by society when they choose not to believe in romantic comedies. So really, they can't win. I think, honestly, having watched this movie for the first time, the main problem is that this sort of formula and this thesis has been replicated so many times by movies that didn't do it quite as well and didn't sell it quite as convincingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this sort of becomes the original sin of the modern romantic comedy, because it sets up this, this trope that gets repeated over and over again, and this question. But I also think that, as we've said, this movie tends to do it pretty well. There are still failings here that don't stand out as much because of the other things the movie does well, but I think frequently when stories try to replicate this, those failings become bigger. And one of the things that I do notice about this movie as I watch it over and over and over again is that it doesn't really make its characters apologize for any faults in themselves when it comes to relationships. Like they have fights and apologize, but it sort of argues that when the timing is right, a relationship will just work out. You get the Carrie Fisher character, who's so funny, and I love her so much, who's in this very unhealthy relationship with a married man. And clearly this is a pattern. Her friends are used to this. They're like, we know about this relationship. We don't support it. We've been very clear. And she's still in it. And then suddenly she meets Jess, who she has an instant connection with. And their relationship is perfect. They instantly move in together. They get married. They have the whole thing. It just all works out. You get Harry and Sally, who have these very, very staunch beliefs about how relationships should work and blah, blah, blah. And because of that, they can't be together. And then as time goes on, they get older, and then suddenly they're just together, and it all works out because the timing's good. There's no real character who has to say, maybe I actually made mistakes in my previous relationship, and I have to learn from that. And I think that's the kind of thing that frequently, when this movie gets essentially remade into other movies like 500 Days of Summer or Maid of Honor, which we talked about, which is that same kind of idea, because their characters aren't quite as strongly written, those faults feel much stronger.
Yeah, and it's charming when Harry Met Sally does it, because it's an amazing movie. I mean, every land of this freaking script just lands.
Oh, yeah.
This movie is Billy Crystal in a way, because you want to dislike it, but you just can't. It charms you. It charms your freaking pants off. I was just sitting in bed so charmed, you're right, Nora Ephron. Maybe men and women can't be friends. I don't mean that. Or maybe I do. I don't know. It was just a great movie, but it's just been replicated so many times, all of the other great trendsetters in their genres. And that I think it's less charming the thousandth time you see it.
Yeah.
I think that if I was making this movie now, I do think that the fix I would do is I would have some scene or other where the Carrie Fisher character and what's-his-face she ends up with have one or the other of them be unavailable when Harry or Sally needs to talk to their best friend. Give them a moment where they go to the other person and then end up having kind of a genuine emotional friendship connection there. And if you just let them each have one clearly platonic friendship that is clearly going to be lifelong, and you don't have to smash people over the head with it, you can just have one little, you've seeded these characters so well. You could just do one little seed. And just, that would be, given how charming the rest of this movie is, and also how smart the rest of this movie is, that would be enough, I think, to... It would be a smooth fix that I think would have a big impact.
Yeah, I think that could make a big difference, just to see, a scene between the Carrie Fisher character and the Billy Crystal character, where they're just chatting. And you're like, aha, there's the... the platonic male-female relationship.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to get at earlier when I was talking about frisson, is that we show this one couple that couldn't be friends with each other because they had frisson from the beginning, that no one can have male-female friendships that are platonic.
Right, and I obviously don't agree with the movie's, pronouncement that men and women can't be friends without sex getting involved. I believe that men and women can be friends, or that two people who can be attracted to each other can be friends, but it doesn't tell as good of a story. You know, you want there to be a point to the relationship. You want it to come to some head.
Although I could absolutely see a contemporary filmmaker just to be like a postmodern dickbag, like make the When Harry Met Sally script, but have the original ending where they have sex and then everything goes to hell.
Honestly, aren't romantic comedies just a matter of timing? You know, if the movie ends right when you've slept with them, like, that would be the moral of the story. We'd be telling a different tale. It's just a matter of timing.
So there's, in romance writing, there's two abbreviations that are very important. There's HEA and HFN. And HEA is obviously the happy ever after. And then the slightly more realistic version of that is the HFN, which is happy for now. And it is very much, it depends where you stop the story. Like, a lot of movies about younger characters, especially like high schoolers or whatever, feature the romantic arc ends in a happy for now. Like if you stopped the story like when they were on the plane, you could stop this at any number of points and it would still feel like some sort of romantic comedy. It would just have a different conclusion.
You also get the juxtaposition between the two main couples, right? You've got Harry and Sally, who are this, it takes them years and years of, you know, beating around the bush, and they almost are together, and they're not together, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then you've got their two best friends who meet and hop in a cab and are, like, bonded for life immediately afterwards. And I do like having that total opposite ends of the spectrum juxtaposition happening. Because it does, like, if you could have an entire story just about Marie and Jess, but it'd be such a different story, even though it's about the same group of friends.
Yeah, I really loved their relationship. It was, I think part of what's so charming about this movie is that it's not like leaning on Harry and Sally's relationship as the only one that you're rooting for, because I definitely rooted for Marie and Jess. Like, I mean, first of all, Carrie Fisher, Space Mom, we miss you. And wow, she was just a force in this movie.
Oh, she was so young.
Yeah. It was beautiful to see her at this time in her life on film. And I loved that the way that they got together was, like you're saying, I mean, it was just this sort of spark. And that's good too. Like, both are valuable. The film, even though it's asking this big question, it's not trying to say one's better than the other. Yeah, just different pathways to happiness. I think it's happily ever after, maybe. I think it's HEA. I like to think so, because I want it for Carrie. I want Carrie to have that.
I think it is notable in this movie to see how both of them change for the better, though. His friendship, his platonic friendship with Sally makes him a better person, and Sally also, like, kind of softens and becomes a more whole and complete personality throughout the movie. So we're really kind of seeing how their friendship, even though the previous incarnation of Harry thought it would be impossible, really made them both better and paved the way for their romantic relationship.
I love that.
So maybe the argument's not men and women can't be friends without the sex getting in the way, but that relationships are stronger if the man and woman are friends.
I like that. That makes me like this movie even more. I think on that note, are we ready to wrap up and talk about not antidotes, but I guess just recommendations, since we all seem to sort of universally think this movie is pretty groovy?
I'm happy to start things off with my antidote or my recommendation.
Go for it.
So I was trying to think, okay, what do I want to pull out of this that could then lead you to watching something else? And I realized as I was watching, right at the end, when you get that great New Year's Eve scene where Harry shows up and does his whole speech. I love when you get the little crinkle over your nose. I love that it takes you 20 minutes to order a sandwich. And it made me think of one of my other favorite big romantic rants in another comedy, actually, which is the movie Bull Durham. For those who haven't seen Bull Durham, it stars Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon, and Kevin Costner is a ball player in a minor league ball club, and Susan Sarandon is essentially a really big fan of the team. there's a scene where she, who is the kind of person much like Harry and Sally, has a lot of philosophies and beliefs and states them very plainly, and she sort of accuses him of not believing in anything and asks him what he believes. And then Kevin Costner just has this great rant where he talks about what he believes, and he talks about romantic things, and he talks about like random thoughts he has on literature and on movies, and he just goes off, and it's this great scene. It's very funny. It's also very attractive. Like, it makes Susan Sarandon's character fall in love with him in that moment. It's excellent. The whole movie is very, very funny, and if you love baseball, it's a great baseball movie. If you love rom-coms, it's a great rom-com. Check out Bull Durham.
Love that. So unconventional. Kate, would you like to go next, or would you like me to go next?
I can go next, although I am going to pull a Janelle and recommend a book. I'm recommending, this is one of my favorite romance novels of all time. It is called Bet Me by Jennifer Cruzy, and it is about two people who go on one date, decide, nope, this is a horrible idea, we should not date. But their friend groups kind of knit together, and so they end up running into each other over and over and over again. And it's a little bit more like straightforwardly romantic than When Harry Met Sally is. But it is definitely about, it feels very much like about like actual like adults with jobs and friendships and found family, and it's got great banter and witty dialogue. So that's my recommendation. Bet Me by Jennifer Cruzy. I love it.
Oh, beautiful. I am on a recommending films kick lately, so I was thinking my recommendation for this, much like Eliza, I was looking for a thread of this film to pull out and see if you were interested in this thread, something that you could pursue. And the part of this movie that I'm the most interested in is this question of emotional intimacy as opposed to physical intimacy, and how those things interact, how they're in contrast with each other, how they're in harmony, how they interfere with each other. And a film that I saw recently that I thought does this incredibly well is written by one of my favorite playwrights, Leslie Headland. It's called Sleeping with Other People. 2015, stars Jason Sudeikis and Alison Brie. It's about friends who lost their virginity to each other in college, meeting up again, only to discover that they are both struggling with sex addiction. So they have to learn how to develop a relationship with each other and emotional intimacy with each other without having sex. And they do not ever have sex over the course of the film. So I find it to be very charming, but also sort of messy and very real portrayal of creating a relationship with someone when you don't have that physical language to use. So that's Sleeping with Other People. Alice, do you have a recommendation?
So I guess I am becoming the movies set in the Regency person. I recommend Love and Friendship. It is
love that movie.
A movie that has been adapted from one of Jane Austen's juvenilia novellas called Lady Susan. Confusingly, Jane Austen has also written a novella called Love and Friendship. However, it is a much better title than Lady Susan. And it's a good movie, and it's funny. And our main character also does not believe you can be friends with men.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being on this ride with us. And as always, a big shout out to our Patreon supporters. Thanks to everybody who's been listening so far. 10 episodes, we've done it. And thank you to Kate and Alice for being here along the way now twice, and Eliza for being here from the very beginning. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for listening to the RomCom Killjoys podcast. If you liked this episode, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at RomCom Killjoys. And if you'd like to support us further, you can become a patron at patreon.com/RomCom Killjoys to gain access to exclusive bonus content. Our theme song is Lady Slut Hitchhike Love by the band A Giant Dog. And the song you're listening to now is a cover of one of my favorites, Baby Love, by Colin Langanis. Remember, Killjoys, don't let anyone kill your joy.